How education destroyed your brain. I want to tell you something that the people who designed your education did not want you to figure out. They gave you 12 years of school, maybe 16, maybe 20 if you went far enough. They sat you in rows, they handed you books. They asked you questions, and then, crucially, they told you whether your answers were right. They measured you, they ranked you. They stamped a number on your forehead and called it your intelligence. And in doing all of that in that entire elaborate, expensive, well-intentioned machinery, they did something to your brain that is going to take you years to undo. If you ever undo it at all, they trained you to be afraid of being wrong. They trained you to need permission before you think. They trained you to confuse knowing the name of something with understanding it. I know this because I spent my life fighting it in myself, in my students, in every lecture hall I ever stood in. I watched brilliant people cripple themselves because school had taught them that curiosity was something you did on a schedule. Between 9 and 3, Monday through Friday, only when a teacher told you it was allowed. The most dangerous thing education ever did was convince you that you already know how to think. You don't. Neither did I, until I unlearned almost everything school taught me. Let me show you what I mean. The name is not the thing. Labels are not knowledge. Let me start with a story. Not a story about physics, a story about a field and a bird and my father. When I was a very small boy, my father used to take me for walks in the woods near our house in Far Rockaway, New York. And he would point to birds and tell me things about them, not what they were called, or rather, not just what they were called. He would tell me what they did. He would watch a bird pecking at the bark of a tree and say, "See what he's doing? He's looking for bugs in the bark. The tree looks smooth to us, but there are tiny insects living just under the surface, and the bird has learned to hear them or sense them somehow, and he pecks right at the right spot." And I would watch the bird with this completely different quality of attention than I would have had if my father had simply said, "That's a woodpecker." And then, and this was the part that mattered, my father would say, "And I don't know how he knows exactly where to peck. That's interesting, isn't it? Somebody should figure that out." He never pretended to know things he didn't know. And he taught me that the gap between the name and the understanding was where all the real thinking happened. Years later, when I was a young student, a boy came up to me and said, "Do you know what the name of that bird is?" pointing to some bird in a bush. And I said I didn't. And he said it was a brown-throated thrush in English, and a Drosselreiher in German, and some other name in various languages. And then he walked away, apparently satisfied. He had demonstrated his knowledge, but he didn't know a single thing more about the bird than I did. He knew the labels in 7 languages. He didn't know anything about how it moved, what it ate, why its feathers were that particular shade of brown, what its song meant, whether it migrated, how it navigated, what its relationship was to the tree it was sitting in. He knew the name. He knew nothing of what mattered. And I realized, standing there, that this was precisely what school had trained him to do. School had taught him that knowing the name was the same as knowing the thing, that having the right label was the same as having the understanding, that if you could write the correct answer on a test, you understood. This is the first and most fundamental way that education destroys your brain. It substitutes nomenclature for knowledge. It teaches you to collect words and arrange them in acceptable patterns, and then it rewards you for doing this. And in rewarding you, it trains you to believe that this word collecting is thinking. It is not thinking. It is cataloging. It is stamp collecting. And there is nothing wrong with stamp collecting. It is a perfectly pleasant hobby, but you should not confuse it with understanding the postal system. The difference between a name and an understanding is enormous, and it matters more than almost anything else in intellectual life. When I teach students physics, the first enemy I have to fight is not ignorance. It is false familiarity. The students have all heard the words force, energy, momentum, wave, field. They can write equations using these words. They can manipulate the symbols correctly and get the right numerical answers. And they are completely confident that they understand what they are doing because they got the right answer. And then I ask them a question that requires actual understanding, a question that cannot be answered by rearranging symbols, that requires them to explain what is physically happening, and they are helpless, completely helpless, not because they are unintelligent, but because school trained them to perform understanding rather than to develop it. Let me give you a specific example. Every student who takes introductory physics learns Newton's first law. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. They can state it. They can write it on a test. And if you ask them, why does a ball thrown in the air slow down and fall back? They will say, correctly that gravity is pulling it down. But ask them this. Before Newton, educated people believed that objects in motion naturally slow down and come to rest. They had been watching the world for millennia, and they observed that everything eventually stops. How did Newton convince people that this intuition was wrong, that the natural state of an object is to keep moving forever? Very few students can answer this, because answering this requires you to actually understand what Newton was claiming, to inhabit the idea, to feel the difficulty of it, to appreciate why it was not obvious, to see why intelligent people before Newton got it wrong and what Newton saw that they didn't. Knowing the name of Newton's first law does not give you any of that. It gives you a label. And labels, while occasionally useful, are not understanding. The first damage that education does to your brain is to convince you that labels are understanding. And once you believe that, you stop looking. Why look further when you already know what it's called? Here's what I want you to do. Right now, today, pick something you think you understand. Anything. A concept from science, from history, from economics, from your own field of work, something where you feel confident that you know what it is. And then this is the exercise. Try to explain it to an imaginary 12-year-old, not with jargon, not with technical terms, with actual description of what is physically, mechanically, causally happening. Most people discover in about 30 seconds that they don't actually understand the thing as well as they thought. The jargon was hiding the gap. The name was acting as a substitute for the explanation. And when you strip the name away and have to explain what is actually happening in plain language, the gaps in your understanding become suddenly uncomfortably visible. This is what Richard Feynman did. This is what I call the Feynman technique, though I never called it that myself. My students gave it that name. And the core of it is not a trick or a technique. It is simply the discipline of refusing to accept labels as understanding, of always asking, but what is actually happening? What, in terms of things I can picture and describe, is going on? School teaches you the opposite of this. School teaches you to accept labels as answers. And accepting labels as answers is the fastest way to turn a curious, searching, wondering mind into a cataloging machine. But this is only the first way that education damages thinking. There are others, and some of them are worse. The correct answer trap, how school made you fear being wrong. Let me talk about the second way that education destroys your ability to think. And this one is more subtle than the first, but I believe it is more damaging in the long run. School teaches you that there is a correct answer. Not just that some answers are better than others, which is true and important, but that for every question, there is one right answer. And the teacher knows what it is, and your job is to produce that answer. This creates a deeply pathological relationship between the student and the question. Instead of the question being an invitation to think, it becomes a test of recall. Instead of uncertainty being interesting, it becomes threatening. And this has a consequence that most people never notice. It makes you afraid of not knowing. Think about what happens in a typical classroom when a teacher asks a question and nobody knows the answer. The silence is uncomfortable. Students look at their desks. Nobody wants to say anything wrong. The teacher eventually gives the answer, and the students write it down, and everyone moves on. And the lesson learned is not the subject matter. The lesson learned is that not knowing is embarrassing, and that the correct response to not knowing is silence. I had the completely opposite experience growing up, and I have spent my life trying to understand why I was so lucky in this regard. My father, because so much of my intellectual character came from him, never treated not knowing as a failure. Not knowing, for him, was the interesting part. It was where the conversation began, not where it ended. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, I asked him why the sun doesn't fall down. This is the kind of question that most adults, when they encounter it, either deflect with a platitude, gravity holds it up, which is not an answer, or dismiss because they don't know the real answer and don't want to admit it. My father sat down with me and said, "Well, that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I can fully explain it, but let me tell you what I understand, and you tell me if it makes sense." And he talked about how the earth and the sun are both moving, and how when things move fast enough sideways, they keep falling, but they keep missing, like throwing a ball around the earth so fast it just keeps curving down toward the earth and missing it. He didn't know orbital mechanics formally. He was using intuitive approximations. Some of them were wrong, but the conversation was extraordinary because it was a genuine attempt to think through a question neither of us fully understood together without the answer being pre-decided. That experience is the opposite of what school does. School pre-decides the answer and asks you to retrieve it, which means school trains you systematically and repeatedly to be a passive recipient of other people's understanding rather than an active generator of your own. And here is where it gets really damaging, because if you have been trained for 12 or 16 years to treat questions as things with pre-existing answers, things you either know or don't know, then when you encounter a question that genuinely has no known answer, you are completely lost. You don't have the tools, you don't have the habit, you don't have the emotional tolerance for the uncertainty. You are trained to find the answer, not to investigate when the answer doesn't exist yet. This is what I mean when I say education destroys your brain. The brain you are born with is extraordinarily good at tolerating uncertainty and making tentative progress in the face of incomplete information. Watch small children. They don't wait to know the right answer before trying something. They try, they fail, they try differently, they observe what happens, they build a model of the world. They are natural scientists. Every child is a natural scientist. And then school happens. And school replaces the natural investigative process with the correct answer retrieval process. And after 12 years of correct answer retrieval, the natural investigative process is so atrophied, so suppressed, that it takes enormous effort to reactivate it. I have seen this over and over again in my students at Caltech, the most prestigious university in the country. The students with the highest test scores, the highest grade point averages, the most impressive records of academic achievement. And the most common problem they have is not lack of knowledge. It is lack of curiosity. It is the inability to sit comfortably with a question that doesn't have an answer yet. It is the desperate need for the teacher to tell them whether they're on the right track. They have been trained so thoroughly to perform correctly that they have lost the ability to explore without a map. They need the destination specified before they can begin the journey. And in research, in actual creative intellectual work, the destination is never specified in advance. That's the whole point. You don't know where you're going. You are genuinely trying to find out something that nobody knows. And if you have spent your whole educational life moving only toward pre-specified destinations, you are paralyzed the moment the map is taken away. This is the second way education damages your brain. It trains you to need permission specifically. It trains you to need confirmation that you're on the right track before you'll commit to an idea. It trains you to outsource your intellectual authority to whoever is in the position of teacher, evaluator, or expert. And when that external authority is removed, the thinking stops. I spent years at Caltech trying to undo this damage in students who were genuinely brilliant, but had been so thoroughly trained to perform correctly that they had become afraid of being wrong. And being wrong is not a catastrophe. Being wrong is how science works. You make a guess, you test it, you find out it's wrong, you make a better guess. That's the process. That's all of it. And if you are afraid of being wrong, you cannot do it. The fear of being wrong is not natural. It is learned. And the place where it is learned, for most people, is school. Now, let me be careful here, because I am not saying that teachers are villains. I know many wonderful teachers who genuinely love their subject and genuinely love their students and work incredibly hard to give those students something real. The problem is not the teachers. The problem is the structure, the exam, the grade, the ranking, the transcript, the whole apparatus of educational measurement that inevitably prioritizes correct performance over genuine understanding. You cannot measure curiosity on a multiple choice test. You cannot grade wonder. You cannot rank students by their tolerance for uncertainty. And so these things are not measured, and because they are not measured, they are not rewarded. And because they are not rewarded, they atrophy. What you can measure, what tests are exquisitely good at measuring, is the ability to retrieve and apply information in a structured, predictable context. And so that is what gets trained. And after 12 years, the retrieval is sharp and the curiosity is dull, and everyone calls this education. I call it something else. School hides, how knowledge is actually made. Now, I want to talk about something that I find genuinely infuriating, though I've been infuriated about it for so long that I've gotten quite calm about it, which might be even more alarming. School does not teach you how knowledge is made. It teaches you what is known. This distinction seems simple, but its consequences are enormous. When you teach students what is known, the finished, polished, confirmed results of centuries of inquiry, you create the impression that knowledge is a kind of edifice that was built is now complete and just needs to be transmitted to each new generation. Students receive the knowledge. Teachers transmit it. Textbooks contain it. Exams verify that it was received. And this creates a completely false picture of what knowledge actually is, where it comes from, and how fragile it is. Let me explain what I mean. In physics, the field I know best, the standard curriculum presents Newton's laws as facts. F equals ma. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Objects in motion stay in motion. These are presented as true, established, unquestionable. And then, a bit later, when students get to the relevant course, they are told that actually Newton's laws are not completely true. They break down at very high velocities where you need special relativity, and at very small scales where you need quantum mechanics. This is presented as a correction, a refinement, as if Newton was almost right, and Einstein and Bohr made him a bit righter. But this profoundly misrepresents what actually happened. Newton was not slightly wrong. Newton was spectacularly, miraculously right about an enormous range of phenomena. And then, at the boundaries of his theory, at the edges of the regime, it was designed to describe he was wrong. And the process by which this wrongness was discovered, and the process by which the new theories were constructed to fix it, was not a smooth, incremental refinement. It was a revolution. It was a catastrophic upheaval in which the basic concepts of space, time, causality, and determinism were reconsidered from the ground up. It was terrifying and exhilarating and deeply contentious, and it took decades and involved dozens of people working at the edge of what was known, making guesses, testing them, discarding them, fighting with each other, being wrong repeatedly before being right. Students are never shown this. They are shown the results. They are shown what Newton said, and then what Einstein said, and then what Bohr said, presented in sequence as if these were simply the successive correct answers, each building cleanly on the last. The mess, the confusion, the wrong turns, the bitter arguments, the personal failures, all of this is edited out. The sausage is hidden. Only the finished product is shown. And this creates a deeply damaging impression that the people who made scientific discoveries were different from you, that they had a special kind of mind that worked differently, that saw things you can't see, that moved with a confidence and directness you don't have, that they knew what they were doing. They did not know what they were doing. Not at first, not when it counted. That is precisely why it was so hard and took so long. I have read the letters that physicists wrote to each other during the development of quantum mechanics. I have read the notes in the papers and the recorded conversations. And what strikes me most, reading them, is how confused everybody was. Not just confused about the answers, confused about the questions, not knowing what they were even trying to understand, arguing ferociously about the meaning of terms they were using every day, making predictions that turned out to be completely wrong, proposing theories that turned out to be nonsense. And out of all that confusion, out of all that error and argument and false starts, the theory emerged, not because some genius saw it clearly from the beginning, but because a community of very smart, very confused people kept pushing, kept testing, kept being wrong, and correcting themselves over decades. This is how knowledge is made. And school never shows you this, because it is too messy, too ambiguous, too difficult to put on a test. The mess of knowledge creation cannot be examined. Only the clean results can be examined. And so the mess is hidden, and students receive the impression that knowledge comes cleanly and from authority. The damage this does is profound, because when students encounter a problem, they cannot solve a question, they cannot answer a situation that doesn't fit any of the patterns they were taught. They conclude that they are not smart enough, rather than concluding that the problem is hard and that being confused is the normal state of someone working at the frontier of their understanding. They give up. Or worse, they pretend to understand. They produce confident-sounding language that doesn't actually mean anything, because they have learned that confident-sounding language is what is rewarded, and admitting confusion is what is penalized. And so the performance of understanding spreads a whole culture of people performing understanding they do not have, afraid to admit confusion, because confusion was never validated, never celebrated, never shown to be the necessary precursor to genuine insight. I've said this many times, and I'll say it again. The first step to knowing something is admitting that you don't know it. This seems obvious. It is obvious. and yet the entire structure of formal education works against it. Because formal education requires you to demonstrate knowledge on schedule, on command, to a specific standard. And there is no mechanism in any exam or assessment I've seen for getting credit for saying, I don't know this yet, but here is the specific shape of my confusion, and here is what I would need to understand to figure it out. That response, which is actually the intellectually mature response, gets a 0 on the test. The confident wrong answer, at least, shows that you tried. The admission of ignorance shows nothing, and so students learn to produce confident wrong answers. They learn to hide their confusion. They learn to perform understanding, and this performance, sustained over years, becomes so habitual that they eventually cannot distinguish it from actual understanding. They genuinely believe they know things they don't know, because they have been performing the knowledge for so long that the performance has become the reality. This is the third damage that education inflicts on the brain. It hides the process of knowledge creation, creates the false impression that knowledge comes from authority, and makes confusion feel like failure rather than feeling like the essential starting point of all genuine inquiry. I know what genuine inquiry feels like. It feels uncomfortable. It feels uncertain. It feels like you might be completely wrong and might have wasted months of work. It feels like you're not smart enough. These feelings are not signs that you're doing it wrong. They are signs that you're doing it right. They are the feelings of a brain actually working on a problem it doesn't yet understand. And they are precisely the feelings that education trains you to avoid. Grades, the most destructive invention in intellectual history. I want to talk about grades because I think the grading system is one of the most destructive inventions in the history of intellectual life. And it is so normalized, so universal, so deeply embedded in our assumptions about education that questioning it sounds crazy. But let me tell you what a grade actually does to the brain. A grade converts an intrinsic motivation, the natural human desire to understand things, which every child has from birth, into an extrinsic motivation. It replaces, I want to know this because it is interesting, with, I need to know this because it will affect my grade. And this substitution, which seems harmless or even beneficial, is in fact catastrophically damaging to long-term intellectual performance. There is decades of research on this. The psychologists who study motivation, people like Edward Deci and Richard Ryan, who developed what is called self-determination theory, have shown repeatedly and robustly that introducing external rewards for activities that people were already intrinsically motivated to do reduces their intrinsic motivation. The phenomenon is called the over-justification effect. When you pay children to read books they were already reading for pleasure, they stop reading for pleasure and read for pay. When you stop paying them, they read less than before you started paying them. The external reward corrupts the internal motivation. School applies this effect systematically to intellectual curiosity. Children arrive at school naturally curious, curious about everything, curious for the pure pleasure of understanding. School then immediately begins attaching grades to intellectual activity. Learn this, and you will be rewarded. Fail to learn it, and you will be penalized. The curiosity is hijacked by the reward system. The child begins working not to understand but to perform, and the performance eventually becomes the goal, and the understanding becomes optional, something that happens on the way to the performance if you're lucky, but not the point. I see this constantly in students at every level. The best students, the ones with the highest grades, the most impressive transcripts, are often the ones who have most thoroughly mastered the performance at the expense of the understanding. They know exactly how to produce what is expected. They have calibrated themselves perfectly to the reward system. They know what a professor wants, and they produce it. And the tragedy is that this skill, this exquisite sensitivity to what is expected and how to deliver it, is almost entirely useless for actual intellectual work, because actual intellectual work does not have a professor. There is no rubric. There is no model answer. There is no one to calibrate to. There is only the problem, and your brain, and whatever tools you can bring to bear. And if your brain has been trained for 16 years to run on the external fuel of grades and evaluation, it has enormous difficulty igniting on the internal fuel of genuine curiosity. The engine works. The fuel is wrong. I was fortunate. I went to MIT and then Princeton, and both were good schools, and I got reasonable grades. But the subjects that I came to understand deeply, the ones where I did genuinely original work, were always the ones where I had found a way to want them for themselves, to need to understand them for reasons that had nothing to do with the grade. Quantum electrodynamics was like that for me. I was genuinely, obsessively, uncomfortably fascinated by the problem of how light and electrons interact. I needed to understand it the way some people need to eat. And because I needed it, I worked on it in a way that was qualitatively different from the way I worked on things I merely wanted to pass. I played with it. I invented notations and diagrams. I approached it from 30 different angles. I spent years on it, and enormous portions of those years were wrong, and it didn't matter, because I wasn't working toward a grade. I was working toward understanding. That experience, that quality of engagement, is what education systematically destroys by replacing intrinsic motivation with extrinsic rewards. Now, here is where I want to push this even further, because the grading problem is bad enough on its own, but it combines with something even more damaging: the concept of intelligence as a fixed quantity. School, by ranking students and assigning permanent numerical identifiers to their intellectual performance, implicitly teaches that intelligence is something you have in a fixed amount. You have a lot of it, or a medium amount, or not very much, and your grades reflect how much you have. Smarter people get better grades. Less smart people get worse grades. The grades are a measurement of an underlying quantity, your intelligence, which exists independently of what you study or how you study it. This belief, which psychologists call the fixed mindset, as opposed to the growth mindset, is one of the most damaging beliefs a person can hold about themselves. And school instills it in most students by the time they are 10 years old. Carol Dweck, the psychologist who has studied this more carefully than anyone, has shown that students who believe intelligence is fixed become risk-averse. They avoid challenges because challenges might reveal that their intelligence is lower than they want it to be. They give up when tasks become difficult, interpreting difficulty as evidence of insufficient intelligence. They are threatened by the success of others, interpreting it as evidence that the other person has more of the fixed resource. And crucially, they don't work to understand things deeply, because deep understanding requires struggling with confusion, and struggling with confusion looks like evidence of low intelligence. It is safer to quickly learn what the test requires and produce the answer than to sit with the confusion and risk being seen as someone who doesn't understand. The students with the growth mindset, the ones who believe that intelligence is built through effort and struggle, behave completely differently. They seek challenges. They interpret difficulty as a sign that they are working on something worthwhile. They sit with confusion because they know that confusion is where growth happens. They recover from failure because failure is information, not judgment. And school, as currently structured, systematically builds the fixed mindset and undermines the growth mindset. Because school is all about demonstrating performance, and demonstrating performance is the behavior of someone trying to prove a fixed level of ability, not someone trying to build an expanding one. I have watched this process ruin people, genuinely, seriously ruin them. I have seen brilliant young students, people with extraordinary natural curiosity, extraordinary natural ability, arrive at Caltech or at conferences or at research group, and within months become pale shadows of what they could have been because they had spent their whole lives demonstrating their intelligence rather than building it, and they had no idea how to do the latter. The grade destroyed them. The gold star destroyed them. The ranking destroyed them. Not because any of those things are inherently evil, but because they trained the brain to optimize for a signal that is not the thing itself. And when you optimize for a signal rather than the thing, you always end up with something hollow. The Brazil problem, learning physics without understanding any of it. I want to tell you about Brazil, because I spent some time there teaching physics, and what I observed in Brazil is the clearest illustration I know of everything I've been describing, the way that education can produce what looks like learning, and is actually its precise opposite. In the 1950s, I was invited to teach physics in Brazil for about a year. And I went and I taught, and I was impressed by the students. They were enthusiastic. They came to class. They studied hard. They passed their exams. They could answer questions. They could solve problems. They seemed, by every measurable criterion, to be learning physics. And then, one day, I gave a talk at the Brazilian Physics Society, and I decided to say what I actually thought. And what I actually thought was this: the students of Brazil are not learning physics. They are learning to perform the appearance of knowing physics, and they cannot tell the difference. I described a specific interaction that had typified my experience. A student would come up to me and demonstrate that he could recite a formula, let's say the formula for the index of refraction of a material. He could write it down perfectly. He could manipulate it algebraically. He could plug in numbers and get correct answers. And then I would ask him, If you have a glass of water and you put a straw in it, why does the straw look bent? And he would have no idea. None. The formula for the index of refraction is exactly the physics that explains why the straw looks bent. But the connection between the formula and the phenomenon, the connection that constitutes actual understanding, was completely absent. The students were not stupid. They were, in many cases, extremely diligent and extremely intelligent. The problem was structural. Their entire educational experience had been aimed at passing exams, and the exams tested formula manipulation, not understanding. So they learned formula manipulation. They became extraordinarily good at it, and they called this physics because their teachers called it physics, and their textbooks called it physics, and their exam results called it physics. It was not physics. It was a costume that physics wore. And the costume was so good, the performance was so polished, that everyone, including the students themselves, had forgotten there was supposed to be a person inside the costume. When I finished talking, there was a silence in the hall, and then the head of the physics department stood up and said, "Dr. Feynman has described our situation exactly." And then he sat down, and everyone knew it was true, and nobody knew what to do about it, because the entire system was built to produce exactly this outcome. And changing the system would mean dismantling the entire apparatus of examinations and rankings and standardized curricula on which the whole educational enterprise depended. This is the trap. The system is self-reinforcing. Exams reward performance. Students optimize for exams. Schools hire teachers who produce students who perform well on exams. Universities select students based on exam performance. And at every stage, everyone believes they are selecting for intelligence and knowledge, when in fact they are selecting for the ability to perform intelligence and knowledge on command. Now, I want to be clear about something. This is not a problem that affects only Brazilian physics students. This is a universal problem, and I have seen it in American universities, in English universities, in institutions all over the world. The Brazilian example struck me because it was so clear and so unambiguous, but the phenomenon is everywhere. And the way it manifests in individuals and people who have been through the full course of modern education is subtle and insidious. Because the person who has learned physics by manipulating formulas does not know that they don't understand it. Their understanding feels exactly like understanding. It has all the surface features of understanding. They can answer questions. They can produce derivations. They can explain things in the language of physics. They have a seamless, apparently coherent narrative about what physics says. And then they encounter a new situation, a situation that isn't covered by any formula they were taught, that requires them to actually reason about what is physically happening, and the performance collapses. Because the performance was built on the formulas, not on the physics, and when the formulas run out, there is nothing underneath. Now, I developed some methods for diagnosing this kind of empty performance, and I want to share them because I think they are genuinely useful. The first method is the novel problem test. Take any concept you think you understand and apply it to a situation you have never encountered before, a situation not covered by any example in your textbook or your coursework. If you genuinely understand the concept, you can do this. If you have only memorized the formula, you cannot. The boundary between real understanding and performed understanding is always visible at the novel problem. The second method is the enemy attack. Imagine the most intelligent, most skeptical critic of your view, and imagine them asking you the most difficult possible question about it. The question they would ask if they were trying to show that you don't actually understand what you claim to understand. Can you answer that question? If you can, you probably understand something real. If the question fills you with anxiety and you realize you don't know how to begin answering it, you are in the world of performance. The third method is what I call the generation test. Without looking anything up, can you generate the thing you claim to know from first principles? Can you derive the formula, not just use it? Can you reconstruct the argument, not just report its conclusion? Can you explain why the assumptions were made, what alternatives were considered, what would change if the assumptions were different? Generation is the test of ownership. If you can generate something, you own it. If you can only reproduce it, you are borrowing it. These tests reveal, with uncomfortable regularity, that much of what people believe they know, they do not in fact own. They have borrowed it, polished it, and presented it as their own. And the borrowing has gone on for so long that they have forgotten they borrowed it. This is what school does. Not maliciously, not deliberately, But inevitably, as a structural consequence of using performance as a proxy for understanding, and then training brains to optimize for the proxy instead of the thing itself. The good news, and there is good news, is that this damage is not permanent. The curiosity is not gone. The capacity for genuine understanding is not destroyed. It is suppressed. And suppressed things can be unsuppressed. And I want to talk about how, because that is ultimately the point of everything I've been saying. How to undo the damage, the way back to real thinking. Let me tell you what I think genuine thinking actually is. Because everything I've said so far has been about what school does wrong, and I believe it, but the picture is incomplete without a description of what right looks like. What does it feel like to think? Actually think, rather than perform thinking. It feels like play. This is not a metaphor. This is literal. The mental state that produces genuine, original insight in science, in mathematics, in any domain, is indistinguishable from the mental state of play. It involves the same quality of absorbed attention, the same freedom from external evaluation, the same willingness to try things that might not work, the same delight in the unexpected, the same readiness to abandon a line of approach when it stops being interesting and pick up another one that looks more promising. I know this because I paid attention to my own mental states throughout my career, and I am quite certain that the best work I ever did, the work on quantum electrodynamics, the path integral formulation, the diagrams, was done in a state that felt like playing with ideas, not working on them, playing with them. And I also know when I lost this state and why and what brought it back. Let me tell you about that, because it is directly relevant to what education does to people. There was a period in my career in the early 1940s when I was at Los Alamos working on the Manhattan Project, when I stopped doing physics the way I normally did it. I was exhausted. I was worried about my first wife, Arlene, who was dying of tuberculosis. I was doing important but grinding technical work, and at some point I realized that I had stopped feeling curious. I was working, but it didn't feel like the kind of working that I found most natural. I was productive, I was doing good work by external standards, but internally something had gone flat. And I was worried about this because I didn't know if it was temporary or if the spark had gone out permanently. I was in my mid-20s, and I wasn't sure if I had already done my best thinking. And then something happened that I have described many times, because it affected me so profoundly. I was sitting in the cafeteria at Cornell. I had gone there after the war, and someone threw a plate in the air, a dining hall plate with the Cornell seal on it. And as it wobbled, I noticed that the red seal was rotating faster than the wobble. And for no reason that had anything to do with any problem I was supposed to be working on, I started thinking about why. Why does the seal rotate faster than the wobble? What is the relationship between the two motions? I started doing the mathematics in my head, and within a few hours I had worked it out. And the relationship between the rotation and the wobble had a factor of 2 in it that I found aesthetically pleasing, and I went to Hans Bethe and told him, and he said, "Feynman, what does that have to do with anything important?" And I said, "Nothing. I just thought it was interesting." And it wasn't important. The wobbling plate was not important. But something about that afternoon of pure play, of following curiosity with no ulterior motive, of working on something for no reason other than it was interesting, unlocked something in me that had been locked. The next 2 or 3 years were some of the most productive of my life. The work on quantum electrodynamics that won the Nobel Prize came directly from the energy and the habit of mind that was reactivated by thinking about a wobbling plate. This is what play does, and this is what school eliminates. Play, by definition, is activity undertaken for its own sake, without external evaluation, without the anxiety of being judged. And the moment you introduce grades, the moment you tell a child that their curiosity will be evaluated and compared to other children's curiosity, you destroy play. You replace it with performance. And performance is a thin substitute for play in intellectual life as in every other domain. So here is what I want to say to you directly, as someone who has thought about this for a long time. If you went through a standard education, and most people reading or listening to this, did you almost certainly have some damage to undo? Not because you are deficient, but because the system was deficient. And it operated on you for years, and it left marks. The mark it leaves is anxiety about being wrong. Undo that first. Being wrong is how you think. When I sit with a problem, I generate bad ideas constantly. Wrong hypotheses, wrong calculations, wrong guesses. The wrong ideas are not failures on the way to the right idea. They are part of the process. Each wrong idea shows me something about the shape of the problem that I didn't see before. The wrong idea is information. It is valuable. Treat it that way. The second mark it leaves is the need for external validation. The constant checking, am I doing this right? Is this what's expected? Is this correct? This is the voice of 16 years of graded performance, and it interrupts thinking at the worst possible moments. You cannot think deeply and check with an external authority simultaneously. Those two activities require different brain states. You have to learn to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing whether you're on the right track long enough to actually make progress, which means you have to develop trust in your own cognitive process. Trust that if you keep thinking carefully, you will eventually get somewhere useful, even if you cannot verify at each step that you're heading in the right direction. The third mark is the substitution of nomenclature for knowledge. Start looking for this everywhere. Every time you catch yourself accepting a word as an explanation, every time you feel satisfied by a label when you should be asking what is actually happening, catch it. Force yourself to explain in physical, causal, visualizable terms what is actually moving, what is actually happening. What would you see if you could observe this directly? The moment you can answer those questions, you understand. The moment you cannot, you are performing. And here is the deepest thing I want to say, because it is the thing I most want people to take seriously. The goal of education should be to produce people who, in the presence of a question they cannot answer, feel interest rather than anxiety, curiosity rather than shame, the impulse to investigate rather than the impulse to pretend. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else, the facts, the formulas, the historical dates, the literary analysis, all of it is secondary. All of it is useful. All of it matters. But all of it can be acquired by a person who has the right relationship to questions. A person who is curious, who can tolerate not knowing, who enjoys the process of figuring things out, that person will learn whatever they need to learn whenever they need to learn it. The facts will come, the skills will come. But a person who is afraid of questions, who has been trained to perform rather than to think, to retrieve rather than to generate, to label rather than to understand, that person is impaired in a way that no amount of additional information will fix. You cannot cure the fear of not knowing by teaching more knowing. You cure it by changing your relationship to not knowing, by learning to find the edge of your knowledge interesting rather than threatening, by getting comfortable, genuinely comfortable with saying, I don't know, and meaning it not as an admission of failure, but as the opening of an investigation. The education system, as currently constituted, does not produce this. It produces, in most cases, the opposite. It produces people who are very good at demonstrating that they know things and very uncomfortable with the reality that there is vastly more that they don't know, vastly more that nobody knows, and that this vastness is not a deficiency in the educational system or in the student, but a feature of reality. An invitation. Every field I have ever looked at closely has turned out to be far stranger, far more interesting, far less settled than it appeared from a distance. The more you know about any subject, the more you realize how much is unknown, how much is uncertain, how many basic questions remain completely open. And this is exhilarating if you are comfortable with not knowing, and terrifying if you are not. School taught you to be terrified. I am trying to make the case that there is another option. The way you were born, the way every child is born, is with the exhilaration, the curiosity, the tolerance for uncertainty, the willingness to try things and be wrong and try differently. The question's asked not to demonstrate intelligence, but because the question is genuinely interesting. That person is still inside you. School put a lot of structure on top of them, a lot of performance, a lot of anxiety about grades and evaluation and being wrong in front of other people. But they are still there. Start playing again. Find something you don't understand and sit with it. Not because it will help your career or impress anyone, but because it is interesting and you want to know. Follow the interest wherever it goes. Be wrong. Be confused. Ask stupid questions. Admit that you don't know things. This is not childish. This is how it actually works. This is how I worked. This is how every scientist I admire worked. Not by performing competence, but by genuinely, awkwardly, often embarrassingly not knowing, and being so fascinated by not knowing that they couldn't stop thinking about it until they did know. That is thinking. That is what education, at its best, should produce. And that is, at its worst, what education most reliably destroys. Undo the destruction. It's not too late. It was never too late. You just have to start being wrong in interesting ways again. And I promise you that the feeling of a real question, genuinely pursued, without a teacher to tell you whether you're right, is one of the best feelings a human brain can have. Don't let them take that from you. Don't let the gold stars and the grade point averages and the performance reviews convince you that you need permission to be curious. You don't. You never did.